The hall smelled of pale wood and something sharper underneath it, and 7 humans were standing on the lowest platform. That detail, the lowest platform, was printed in the mission brief under structural clarity. The founding architects had used that phrase without irony. The delegate platforms were graduated by species rank, and the Vethori Supremacy had been ranking species for 90 years. The humans stood where the brief said they would stand. The smell was in the brief too. Atmospheric conditioning, pale wood resin extract, concentration 0.3 parts per million. Director Orvin Castledrain had read that line 3 times. He had not been prepared for what it would do to him when it finally reached him through a live relay feed, 14 light-years away. 7 people, 11 seconds. The broadcast to 11,000 watching species cut mid-frame. No warning, no debate, no record that it had happened at all. The Vethori Supremacy released a formal statement within the hour. 4 sentences, the last one read, "The matter is concluded." In a building in Geneva with no external signage, on a street that appeared on no published map of Earth's diplomatic infrastructure, Director Orvin Castledrain received the notification at 3:12 local time. He read it once. He read it again. He set down his tea on the left side of his desk, which was where he always set it, and then he did something he had not done in 11 years. He reached across the desk and turned a photograph face down. The photograph had been face up for 11 years. He had never explained it to anyone on his team. They had learned not to ask. He picked up his comm unit and made one call. "Tell the shepherd it's time." That was all. He set the comm unit down next to the tea. He did not drink the tea. He sat in the chair where he had sat for 31 years in a building that appeared in no public record, and he waited for the sound of his team arriving. Stay with this one. What Earth had been building for 31 years, that part comes next. You'll want to hear how it opens. 31 years earlier, the Office of Strategic Patience had not yet had a name. It had a desk. It had Orvin Castledrain, 30 years old, recently moved from the Interstellar Treaty Analysis Division after writing a report that his director called operationally premature, and his director's director called not the kind of thing we circulate. The report had documented a pattern. 19 incidents across 40 years, 14 species affected, always the same legal structure, always the same result. A public proceeding, a formal finding, a statement of conclusion, no consequence. The report had been filed. Castledrain had been moved sideways into a sub-bureau with a budget line that read, Archival Services Coordination, and a staff of 1, which was himself. He had considered, briefly, whether this was a punishment. Then he had sat down at the desk, opened a new file, and started from the beginning. The building had no external signage because no one had gotten around to putting any up, and then enough years passed that it stopped seeming necessary. The budget line stayed what it was because nobody reviewed it closely enough to update it, and then enough years passed that the obscurity became a feature. By year 15, the Office of Strategic Patience had a name. Castledrain had given it to himself, quietly, in a margin note on a quarterly report that no one read, and a staff of 6. No warning, no public listing, no budget line anyone would look for twice. You have to understand what the Vethori Supremacy was, before you can understand what 31 years of work inside a building with no signage was actually for. The Supremacy was 3 species in formal block, led by the Kethul, semi-aquatic, long-lived, patient in the way that only a species whose senior members averaged 290 years could be patient. They had held the Galactic Compact's Security Council seat for 90 years. They had helped write the Compact Charter. They had never, in 90 years, been subject to its enforcement mechanisms. That last part was not an accident. The Kethul Legal Institute had written Article 9, Subclause 3 of the founding charter in 2271. It required the tribunal to convene within 48 hours of a multi-species competition. It was a good clause. It was a fair clause. The Kethul legal scholars who wrote it had assumed, apparently, that a multi-species competition would never be successfully organized against the Supremacy. They had not written a safeguard against it. They had not considered it necessary. Castledrain had read Article 9, Subclause 3 for the first time in year 4. He had read it 11 more times across the following years. He had never flagged it in any report. He had kept it in a handwritten note in the back of his desk drawer, folded twice. High Convocant Drevoskel had written the founding charter. He had never considered that someone would read it on his behalf. The team assembled at the desk in the unmarked building by 4:30. They came the way they always came after bad nights, quietly, without being told twice, carrying things from home. Castledrain made rice. He always made rice on hard nights, on the small burner in the back room that had been there since year 3 and had never been on any equipment manifest. Ambassador Yendavanos brought flatbread, the same flatbread she always brought from the same place on the same street. No one commented on this. It was the kind of ritual that develops in a team that has spent years learning how to hold weight without putting it down. No one mentioned the 7 names. That silence had its own grammar. They had all learned it. They ate. The recycled air in the building had that familiar low hum, a frequency Castle Drain had stopped noticing around year 8 and now only heard again on nights like this. Davina set her clay dish of river stones on the corner of the briefing table. She had brought it in year 22, smooth gray stones in a small clay bowl, and every morning since she moved 1 stone to the edge of the dish. She had never explained why. The team had learned not to ask about that either. Dr. Rennie's Valos arrived last, carrying her annotated copy of the Compact Founding Charter, all 14 language versions bound together. The binding cracked at page 144 because that was where Article 9 lived, and she had opened it there more times than she could count. She set it on the table without a word and sat down. Commander Thale Oren Vass, across from her, was already running the positioning checks. He did not look up. Castle Drain watched his team eat rice and flatbread in a building that did not officially exist. And he felt, under the weight of the evening, something that was not quite relief and not quite grief, but sat in the space between them where 31 years of compressed waiting had lived. He turned the photograph back over in his mind, or rather, no. He did not do that. He had turned it face down for a reason, and the reason was that tonight was not the night to look at it. Here is what the Vethori Supremacy had done, before the night that ended everything. 19 times in 61 years, always public, always with legal pretext, always concluded within the hour. They had done it to Ilan Trade Liaisons in year 12 of the count, and to Sulhari Compact Envoys in year 24, and to a Drevin Freelane's diplomatic observer 22 years ago whose species kept their own census and did not register with compact systems, which meant the Supremacy had correctly calculated that no one with standing would file on their behalf. They had kept excellent records of all of it. That was the part that Castle Drain had spent 11 years finding almost funny, almost, in the dark, quiet way of someone who no longer had the energy for actual amusement. The Supremacy kept meticulous records. They filed their internal communications through compact relay infrastructure. Every incident had a case number. Every case number had a file. Every file was, in theory, accessible to any party with legal standing before the tribunal. Analyst Sen Velras had spent 6 years routing those files through a sympathetic communications engineer whose name was not in any record anywhere, not even Velras's own notes, which were themselves stored in a location that appeared in no compact database. The sympathetic engineer had never asked what the files were for. Velras had never told them. Some partnerships operated on the principle that understanding could come later, after the work was already done. By the morning after the notification, the filing stood at 2,847 pages. 19 exhibits, 61 years of pattern, 14 species. The burning of the 7 human envoys was Exhibit 19, not because it was the worst, but because it was the most recent and the most documented, and because it had relayed footage from 11 angles and internal Supremacy communications that had been filed within 6 minutes of the broadcast cut. The matter is concluded, the statement had read. The filing disagreed. Valos submitted it at 300 galactic standard, not for strategy, or not only for strategy. The Supremacy's Legal Monitoring Bureau ran on a 6-hour processing delay. The filing would be in the tribunal's formal record before anyone in the Supremacy's legal apparatus had read the subject line. By the time they did, the 48-hour convening window required by Article 9, Subclause 3 would already be running. The tribunal had no procedural mechanism to stop it. The clause didn't allow one. The Kethul legal scholars who had written it had not included an exception because they had not imagined one would be needed. Valos sent the confirmation to Castle Drain at 3:04. He read it at 3:06 at the desk in the building with no signage. He did not celebrate. He picked up his tea, found it had gone cold, and set it back down. "It's in," Valos said from across the room. "I know," he said. "That was all." The filing had 12 co-signatories. That was the second piece. The piece the Supremacy's legal monitors would not see coming when they finally pulled up the docket and read past the subject line. A single-species petition could be challenged on standing grounds. It could be referred, delayed, procedurally deferred. The Compact's history was full of single-species petitions that had died in referral. 12 was different. 12 required the tribunal to convene. Article 9 said so. The Supremacy had written Article 9. The 12 co-signatories had not been easy to find. They had been easy to find eventually, but not for 31 years, for 6 months, after the notification, after the rice and the flatbread, and the silence with its own grammar. Castle Drain had known they were out there. He had known because he had read the Supremacy's own records, and the records showed that they were out there, small species. Most of them. Species that had attended tribunal sessions for years without once expecting the session to matter. Species that had filed alone and watched their filings die in procedural referral, and had concluded reasonably that there was no point in filing again. They had not stopped keeping records. Senior archivist Velren of the Ilan species had been keeping records of the pattern for 40 years. The Ilan were small, average height 1.1 meters, gray-skinned, 4-digit hands adapted over generations for archival work, voices that moved slowly and gave each word its own space. They were not good at being heard in deliberation chambers. The Compact's founding architects had, in the interest of structural clarity, placed them on the second lowest delegate platform. They had been filing pattern documentation for 40 years. Their records had no formal standing before the tribunal unless someone with standing carried them. They had kept filing anyway. Velren read all 2,847 pages of the Earth filing by 600 on the morning it entered the tribunal record. She had been awake since 300, sitting in her archive room on the Ilan delegation's assigned station, reading with the patient attention of someone who has been doing this for 40 years and knows exactly what she is looking at. At 6:12, she called Ambassador Yen Davanos directly. Davanos was at the briefing table, the clay dish in front of her, one stone moved to the edge. She picked up the call on the second ring. Velren said, "I have been keeping records of this pattern for 40 years. I did not know someone else was too. What do you need from me?" Davanos moved a second stone to the edge of the dish. "Introduce me," she said, "to everyone who has been waiting." Over the 72 hours that followed, Senior Archivist Velren made introductions. The Sulhari Compact, mid-height bipeds whose subdermal pigmentation shifted under stress, whose trade network covered more relay nodes than any other species in the Outer Compact, had lost 2 trade representatives to Supremacy internal proceedings in year 31 of the count. They had not filed because they had no fleet and no leverage, and they had understood correctly that a single species petition from a species with no fleet and no leverage would die in referral. They had the relay infrastructure. They had sympathetic engineering contacts throughout the Compact's signals architecture. They had been waiting for someone to tell them the pieces were ready to move. The Dreven Freelanes, nomadic, vessel-born, recognized by the Compact only as transit designees, which meant they had no permanent legal standing in deliberation, but could serve as witnesses, had lost a diplomatic observer 22 years ago. The observer's name was in the Supremacy's records. It was in Castle Drain's filing as Exhibit 7. The Dreven had kept their own census of it, the way they kept their own census of everything outside Compact systems, in a format that the Compact had never asked to read. There were 10 others, small, afraid, angry in the quiet way of species that have been told repeatedly that the system exists for them while watching the system conclude matters against them within the hour. They filed, they signed, they waited. Together, they submitted 3,400 formal witness testimonies, jointly, simultaneously, to a tribunal that the Supremacy had founded, funded, and publicly revered as the instrument of galactic order. The Supremacy's legal bureau received the automated notification at 900. They filed a procedural dismissal request at 917. The testimonies had been in the system since 743. The dismissal request was noted, logged, and archived as document 2,848 in the case file. It was still being processed when the tribunal formally acknowledged the convening requirement. Castle Drain received the confirmation from Velras at 400 the following morning. He had been awake. He read the message once. The tribunal had been formally required to convene. The 48-hour window had started. The dismissal request had been archived. There was no procedural exit remaining. He did not celebrate. He sat at the desk, in the building with no signage, and he reached across the surface and turned the photograph face up. He had not looked at it in 3 days. The team had not asked. They had learned years ago that the photograph was not a topic. But the 3 members of the team who were in the room at that hour glanced at it when he turned it, and what they saw was a group of people, 7 of them, standing together in a room that smelled, if you knew the atmospheric specifications, of pale wood and something sharper underneath. The photograph had been taken in the convocation hall, 14 light years from Geneva, 31 years ago. Castle Drain looked at it for a long time. He did not tell anyone what the photograph meant to him or what it had cost him to keep it face up for 31 years and face down now. He did not need to. The team had been with him long enough to do the math. He set the photograph back down, face up this time, and did not touch it again. "The Shepherd," said Commander Envoys from the far end of the room without looking up from his positioning screen. 47 vessels, ready on your call." Castle Drain nodded once. "Call it," he said. The Shepherd was not a weapon. 47 vessels, registered as civil freight coordinators with the Compact Transit Authority, carrying no weapons manifests, flying no military designations, crewed by people whose personnel files listed them as logistics officers with no combat classification. Envoys had been building it for 9 years. Every vessel had been positioned incrementally, over years, along routes that intersected naturally with the Supremacy's 3 core system. No single repositioning had been unusual. No pattern had been visible until you looked at all 47 movements together, on the same map, at the same time. He had never shown the complete map to anyone outside the team. They filed, they moved, they waited. That was all they had ever done. Envoys sent the positioning orders at 4:07. Not a command, just a timestamp release, activating pre-filed transit schedules that the vessels had been holding for 60 days. Civil freight coordinators returning to registered routes. Nothing in any of the filings that contradicted anything in compact transit law. Over the following 31 hours, 47 vessels completed their repositioning. The formation was visible on every sensor array in the sector, a precise geometric pattern surrounding the Supremacy's 3 core systems on all approach vectors. No weapons armed, no communications transmitted to the Supremacy, no message of any kind. The Supremacy's shipping lanes stopped functioning within 31 hours of the formation completing. No sabotage was detectable because no sabotage had occurred. The vessels were simply there, in the way that a closed door is in the way, not hostile, not threatening, just present, requiring acknowledgement before anything else could happen. 47 vessels, no weapons registered, no communications sent. The Supremacy's shipping lanes stopped in 31 hours. That is what geometry looks like when it has been patient long enough. High Convocant Drevoskel convened an emergency session of the Supremacy's internal council within 6 hours of the formation completing. He stood, 2.1 meters, lateral gilfans held flat in the posture of institutional authority, and he requested that the compact tribunal delay proceedings pending a Supremacy counterfiling. The tribunal noted the request. The 48-hour convening window, required by Article 9, Subclause 3, which the Cthulhu Legal Institute had authored in 2271, had been running for 39 hours. The tribunal could not delay. The clause did not allow it. The same clause that had protected the Supremacy for 90 years, that had given the tribunal its authority and its structure and its claim to neutrality, was the reason the tribunal could not stop now. Drevoskel's gilfans flushed deep amber. In Cthulhu cultural reading, amber was authority. Amber was the color of certainty, of rank assumed rather than displayed, of a creature that had never needed to argue for its position because its position had never been seriously challenged. He had presided over 14 internal proceedings in 40 years. He had left no written record of personal opinion on any of them. He had never been in the same room as a consequence. He was in one now. 47 vessels held their positions, while the compact's legal machinery ran. That is how it worked, not with orders, not with movement. The vessels sat in their geometric pattern around the Supremacy's 3 core systems, registered as civil freight coordinators, and the shipping lanes stayed stopped because the shipping lanes could not function with 47 civil freight coordinators occupying the approach geometry. There was nothing to intercept, nothing to board, nothing to cite. The Supremacy's legal bureau spent 31 hours looking for the action that had been taken against them and could not find it, because the action was the absence of movement. An absence of movement by civil freight coordinators was not, technically, anything at all. High Convocant Drevoskel understood this. That was the part that mattered. He understood it completely within 6 hours of the formation completing. His analysts confirmed the geometry. His logistics team confirmed the lane interruptions. His legal bureau confirmed there was nothing in compact transit law that addressed a formation of civil freight coordinators that was not moving. He had written Schedule 7 himself, 30 years ago, and Schedule 7 covered vessels in transit. These vessels were not in transit. They were at rest. They were resting in the exact positions where their registered routes happened to take them. His gilfans had been amber since the briefing. He requested that the tribunal delay proceedings. The 48-hour window ran. In the building in Geneva with no external signage, Castle Drain sat at his desk and did not sleep. He made tea twice. He drank neither cup. Across the room, analyst Sen Velras ran the signal monitoring at a low hum. The recycled air, the screens, the quiet back and forth of a team that had learned to operate in the particular register of people who are waiting for something they have spent most of their adult lives building toward. Commander Thale Orenvas did not leave his positioning station. He had rehearsed 1,400 simulations across 9 years of formation building. He had never been required to use one. The formation had been designed so that it would not need to be used, so that its presence alone would do the work that 1,000 simulations had prepared him to do by other means. He watched the sensor arrays and drank water and said nothing. Dr. Rennies Valos had the founding charter open on her workstation. Not to read it, she had read it. She had the Supremacy's counterfiling request on the other screen, cross-referencing it against Article 9 in real time. Every procedural objection they filed, she found the clause that closed it. She was noting them in the margin of a document that would never be published and would not need to be. Ambassador Yendava Nas was not in the building. She was already in transit, aboard a compact relay vessel, 12 hours out from convocation anchorage Sarathavel. She had her clay dish of river stones on the transit table beside her, and she was reading the terms document for the 4th time, not because she had missed anything, but because she wanted to know every word the way you know the weight of something you are about to set down after carrying it for a long time. She moved no stones. The Ilan delegation station was 3 hours by relay from Earth's transit vessel, and Senior Archivist Velren had been awake since before the filing went in. She was small, Ilan small, which meant the archive room's standard furniture was built for species twice her height, and she had long since arranged it around herself with the patient practicality of someone who has spent 40 years working in spaces not designed for her. Her hands moved slowly across the pages. 4-digit, adapted for archival work, trained across decades to treat documents the way you treat something that matters. She had been keeping records of the pattern for 40 years. She had filed 3 times alone through the Ilan delegation's formal channel. All 3 filings had died in procedural referral, not rejected, referred. The distinction was important to the people who made it and meaningless to the people it happened to. She had kept the referral notices in a folder. She had kept filing. When the Earth filing hit the Tribunal record at 300, her monitoring system flagged it within 4 minutes. She read for 3 hours before she called. Davanos answered on the 2nd ring, 12 hours out from Sarathavel, clay dish beside her. The terms document face down. I have been keeping records of this pattern for 40 years, Velren said. Her voice moved the way Ilan voices moved, slowly, each word given its own space, no word more important than the one before or after it. I did not know someone else was too. What do you need from me? Davanos set the terms document aside. She moved a 2nd stone to the edge of the clay dish. Introduce me, she said, to everyone who has been waiting. Over the 72 hours that followed, Velren made introductions. The Solhari Compact sent their relay coordinator within 6 hours. The Dreven Freelanes dispatched their senior transit witness by the end of the 1st day. The others came in stages, some quickly, some after long conversations that Velren conducted with the patience of someone who had been waiting 4 decades for the right moment and understood that the right moment required care. You could not rush a species into trust. You could only demonstrate that the trust had been earned, document by document, exhibit by exhibit, across the years when it had seemed like no one was watching. 10 species, then 12. They were small, most of them. They had attended tribunal sessions for years without expecting the sessions to matter. They had filed alone and watched their filings die in referral, and they had concluded, as any reasonable species would conclude, that the system was not designed for them. They had not stopped keeping records. They filed, they signed, they submitted. 3,400 formal witness testimonies, joint, simultaneous, entered into the tribunal record of a body the Supremacy had founded, funded, and treated as institutional theater for 90 years. The Supremacy's legal bureau received automated notification of the testimonies at 900. They filed a procedural dismissal request 17 minutes later. The testimonies were already in the system, had been for hours. The dismissal request was logged, noted, and filed as a tribunal administrative record. It was not acted on. There was no mechanism by which it could be acted on. Article 9, Subclause 3 did not include a provision for dismissal of a multi-species co-petition that had already met the convening threshold. The Kethul legal scholars who had written it had not included such a provision. They had not considered one necessary. Castle Drain received Velras's confirmation at 400. He read it once. He set the message down on the desk beside the cold tea. He looked at the photograph for a moment, face up now, the way it had been for 31 years before the notification, the way he had turned it back after the confirmation that the tribunal was required to convene. 7 people standing together. A room that smelled, if you knew the atmospheric specifications, of pale wood and something sharper underneath. He did not say anything out loud. He reached across the desk and turned the photograph so that the 7 faces caught the light from his workstation screen. He had not done that before. The team, the 3 of them still in the room at that hour, saw him do it. They did not ask why. Some things do not require explanation. They require witness. Envoys sent the dispersal timestamp at 4:07 on the 7th day after the ruling. Not before. 6 days of holding position, no orders, no communications to the Supremacy. On the 7th day, civil freight coordinators filed standard transit departure logs, logistics vessels returning to registered routes. Nothing unusual, nothing flagged. And the formation came apart the way formations come apart when they were never formations to begin with. 47 vessels, 47 sets of transit papers, 47 routes that had been on file before any of this began. The Supremacy's shipping lanes resumed within hours. No acknowledgement was exchanged. No statement was released. No communication passed between the Supremacy's legal bureau and the Office of Strategic Patience, because the Office of Strategic Patience did not officially exist, and the Supremacy had no formal channel to address something that had no name. Envoys noted the dispersal in his mission log and closed the positioning screen for the first time in 9 days. He made himself tea. He drank it. Drevoskel did not attend the post-ruling session. His delegation submitted a written statement contesting the jurisdiction of the enforcement provisions. 4 pages, formally structured, citing 12 precedents. It was entered into the tribunal record as a standard post-ruling objection. It was document 2848 in the case file. Dr. Rennies Valos noticed this while updating the index. She noted it in the margin of the working document she kept for herself, not the official file, the working one, the one where she tracked the things that were worth tracking privately. She wrote, 2848, their objection joins the record they spent 61 years creating. Then she closed the margin note and did not mention it to anyone. No one on the team was celebrating. Celebration had a grammar the way the silence had a grammar, and this was not its shape. What this felt like was the particular quiet of an argument that has been running for 31 years, finally settling into resolution. Not loudly, not triumphantly, but the way a very long-held note releases. 3 weeks passed. The 12-species coalition filed a joint request with the Compact to establish a standing multi-species witness registry, a permanent mechanism, formally structured, for pattern documentation across species who lacked individual standing before the tribunal. Velren agreed to serve as its first custodian without being asked twice. She said, I have 40 years of material. The index alone will take 6 months. The registry's first entry was a cross-indexed reference to all 2,847 pages of the Earth filing, with Ilan archival notation added in the margins. Velren's notations ran to 44 additional pages. She had been waiting to write them for a long time. The Supremacy's Security Council seat remained vacant. The Compact's charter did not require the seat to be filled immediately, and no species had yet filed a formal candidacy. The tribunal's ruling on transit rights for the Supremacy's 3 core systems had set a minimum suspension of 40 years. The 19 named officials were in individual accountability proceedings that would run, Valos estimated, for at least 3 years. None of this had been announced. The Compact did not make announcements. It entered rulings into the record. The record was the announcement. 3 weeks after the ruling, an encrypted message arrived on Davanos's personal relay. It was from Velren, short, Ilan formal short, which was shorter than most species casual. It read, My species has a word for what your office built. A rough translation, the patience of those who document what they cannot yet prove, for the generation that will be able to. We did not have a word for what your office did next. We are making one. Davanos read it twice. She set her relay down on the briefing table beside the clay dish. 23 stones were on the edge of the dish. She had moved one each morning for 23 days since the ruling. She looked at them for a moment. Then she moved one more. Now for what the ruling cost and what it was built on. No weapons, no armed conflict, no fleet engagement, no military casualties, no destruction of anything the Supremacy had built across 90 years of Compact membership, except the legal insulation it had trusted completely. 19 incidents. 61 years, 14 species who had tried to speak and been told the record was closed, and 7 people who had stood on the lowest platform, 14 light years from Geneva, in a room that smelled of palewood resin, and had not come home. The Office of Strategic Patience had been built for many reasons. Castle Drain had never publicly stated any of them, but there was one reason that had come before the pattern analysis, and before the recognition of Article 9, and before the slow, 31-year construction of something the system could not dismiss. There was a group of 7 people he had known. A small ceremony was held outside the building in Geneva, the building with no external signage, on the street that appeared on no published map. No gallery, no broadcast, no relay feed to the compact or anywhere else. Castle Drain stood in the morning light and read 7 names aloud. Not ranks, not titles, not operational designations or file numbers or the exhibit classification that had eventually given each of them a place in the record. Just the names they had used with each other, in the way people use names when they have spent years working in the same small building and know the sound of each other's footsteps in the corridor. 7 names, he read them without pausing. Behind him, a stone cutter had come the previous afternoon and worked for 3 hours on a plain gray piece of stone that had been set into the building's exterior wall at eye level, because that was where it belonged and no other location had been considered. The stone was unpolished. The letters were cut directly into it, no gilding, no border. Below the 7 names, 1 line. They were not the end of the record. They were the reason it was finished. The 6 of them stood there for a while after. Valos had her annotated charter under her arm. She had brought it the way you bring something that has been part of every significant day for 30 years, not because it was needed, but because it would have been wrong to leave it behind. Orenvas stood with his hands at his sides, the way he always stood when he was not at a positioning screen. Velras had her eyes on the names. Calthane was to the left of Castle Drain, 1 step back, the way she had always stood in every briefing for 8 years. Davanos had the clay dish. She had brought it from the briefing table, wrapped carefully, and now she held it in both hands, the smooth gray stones. Most of them moved to the edge, the weight of each morning's small reckoning gathered in a small clay bowl. She had never explained the ritual. She had moved a stone each morning for 23 years, and no one had ever asked her to. She looked at the stone for a while. Then she looked at the names. Then she looked at Castle Drain, who was looking at the names the way you look at something you have been carrying toward for a very long time and have finally been able to set down. Nobody spoke. The ventilation had cycled in the hall at Sorathavel when the ruling was read. The palewood resin smell thinned and did not return. The atmospheric conditioning ran its normal cycle, and the extract concentration dropped and nobody mentioned it. Analyst Sen Velras noted it in the session log as a maintenance anomaly, the exact phrase, filed under atmospheric systems routine. It would be reviewed and cleared by the Tribunal's facilities team within the standard window. It was not a maintenance anomaly. Back in the building, in the back room on the windowsill where it had always been, the small plant stood in its clay pot. Davanos had brought it in year 9. It had no particular significance. It was the kind of plant you put on a windowsill in a room where you spend most of your time, because rooms where you spend most of your time should have something alive in them. She had watered it every week for 22 years, through every hard night and every quiet morning, and every year that the filing grew by another volume and the pattern continued and the patience held. She watered it now. She did not explain anything. There was nothing left that required explanation.